Let's discuss why you're not getting the desired effects from your ADHD medication or why you're still getting side effects. Not just do side effects suck, but if you don't get the effects you want, it's also a hell of a waste of money. So let's get into it right after the disclaimer. Hey friends, I'm Jonas, I'm a master's student and I'm currently working as an AI engineer, and I myself had a lot of struggle focusing due to my ADHD. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of the lucky people who would just pop some Ritalin, which is the standard prescription here in Germany, and have all issues resolved. Instead, I had to go through a lineup of ADHD medications with missing effects and a lot of side effects, and oftentimes I felt like the doctors did not really help me well getting in tune with the right medication. So, first things first, the most important thing is to find a good psychiatrist that listens to your feedback and that tailors the medication to you. However, the flip side is our own homework to understand what we're taking, how exactly it works, and how it can backfire to really evaluate whether we're on the right path. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. I want to make clear I'm not a medical doctor. This is just my own experience and years of deep research of the topic, but this is not medical advice. So let's get into what medications even exist for the treatment of ADHD. When the FDA approves ADHD medications, it drops it in one of two buckets: stimulants and non-stimulants. That's just not a mechanistic differentiation, but it's also a legal differentiation because the stimulants are Schedule II drugs, so they're way more regulated. Inside the stimulant basket fall two types of chemical families: methylphenidate, which again is the first line prescriptions here in Germany, and amphetamines, which, for example, in the form of Adderall, is the first line prescription in the US. In the US, there are different types of amphetamines used for the treatment of ADHD. The two main ones are levoamphetamine and dextroamphetamine. Adderall, for example, is a 3-to-1 mix of dextro to levoamphetamine. And technically, there's even another differentiation regarding the dextroamphetamine because there's a molecule called lisdexamphetamine, which is an extended release version of normal dextroamphetamine, which is achieved by adding a lysine amino acid to the dextroamphetamine molecule. That lysine is then slowly chopped off over the day in our red blood cells, and that slowly releases the dextroamphetamine throughout the day. But we will get into that later. Finally, I also want to mention that there is also methamphetamine used for the treatment of ADHD, even though it's very rarely used. That's especially interesting to me as a German because Germany has a long history of methamphetamine use. In the Third Reich and up until the 1970s, it was used as a drug Pervitin, and many influential German people, most known Adolf Hitler, but also the first German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, famously used methamphetamine very regularly. But that's just a side note. Let's get into the second basket, which are the non-stimulants. Here, there is the molecule atomoxetine, most commonly known as Strattera, as well as alpha-2 agonists. Alpha-2 agonists are, for example, guanfacine and clonidine, and those work very interestingly, which we'll get into later. Also, there's a relatively new drug called Qelbree, and we will also briefly touch on that. Looking at these two baskets, the data in the US paints a clear picture of stimulants being the most commonly used drugs for the treatment of ADHD, specifically amphetamines, followed by methylphenidate. Now, let's get into how these drugs actually work mechanistically. Both the stimulants and the non-stimulant drugs primarily work through the dopamine and the norepinephrine system. Dopamine and norepinephrine are both neurotransmitters, and dopamine can be understood as intrinsic motivation, norepinephrine as extrinsic motivation. Now, that's not really scientific, but I guess it gives you a good feeling of what they actually feel like. Dopamine is a very pleasurable hormone. Most people like to feel high dopaminergic signaling. It's the hormone that drives motivation, it's the hormone that drives pleasure in doing things, it makes you interested in things, and it also causes addiction to things. Norepinephrine, on the other hand, is really what drives you forward. It's more a hormone of pressure, I would say. It really gets you going, but it doesn't necessarily feel nice. It's a kind of feeling you get when you're late to study to an exam and suddenly in the last day you get way more done than in the weeks you studied before because you really have the pressure now. And so you are kind of motivated to study for an exam, but it's not pleasurable like playing a video game. You're also motivated while playing this video game you really like, and the video game is more like the dopaminergic feeling of motivation. Now, how do these drugs affect dopamine and norepinephrine? We'll focus on amphetamine, methylphenidate, and atomoxetine first because the alpha 2 agonists are a little bit different and very interesting. We'll look into those later. To understand it, let's look into our brain. I'll make this really simple. We have cells that send out neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine. Those are called the presynaptic neurons, and we have cells in our brain that sense those neurotransmitters, called the postsynaptic neuron. And between those cells, there's a very small space called the synaptic cleft. In the synaptic cleft, there are a bunch of neurotransmitters floating around, and the more are floating around there, the more can be connecting to these little receptors that sense the stimulation of the dopamine or of the norepinephrine. Now, all three drugs, amphetamines, methylphenidate, and atomoxetine, work by increasing those neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft and thus increase the signal of the neurotransmitters. So there are more neurotransmitters sensed by the receptors. Specifically, there are two mechanisms by which those drugs increase the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine in the synaptic cleft. The first one is called reuptake inhibition. Sounds difficult, but I'll make this really simple. There are transporters that move dopamine and norepinephrine out of the synaptic cleft. Dopamine transporters and norepinephrine transporters. And obviously, moving them out reduces the amount of neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft and thus the signal. Reuptake inhibition means that the transporters that move these neurotransmitters out of the synaptic cleft are inhibited. So they're not working well anymore. Which means if we inhibit the dopamine transporter, there's less dopamine moved out. And if we inhibit the norepinephrine transporter, there's less norepinephrine moved out. And more of the neurotransmitters can accumulate in the synaptic cleft. Atomoxetine, so for example Strattera, is only a reuptake inhibitor of norepinephrine. So it only leads to an increased accumulation of norepinephrine in the synaptic cleft. Amphetamines and methylphenidate, on the other hand, are working both as a reuptake inhibitor for norepinephrine, but also for dopamine. So they increase the amounts of dopamine and norepinephrine in the synaptic cleft via the reuptake inhibition. Now, amphetamine does even more. Amphetamine also works through the second way to increase dopamine and norepinephrine. And that second way is called increase of transmission. That basically means more neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. So you see these little reserves of neurotransmitters in the presynaptic neuron right here. Amphetamine causes more release of these neurotransmitters in this space, and in addition, as we mentioned before, it also reduces the amount of neurotransmitters that are moved out. So while amphetamines, methylphenidate, and atomoxetine all increase either the signaling of norepinephrine or both dopamine and norepinephrine, the other class of drugs, the alpha 2 agonists, are very interesting because they actually do something opposite. They're agonists to the alpha 2 receptors, and the alpha 2 receptors are receptors in the adrenergic system. Very complicated sounding, but I'll break this down for you simply, okay? Activation of the alpha 2 receptors decreases the norepinephrine signaling. And the idea behind that is to increase the so-called signal to noise ratio, which means in an ADHD brain you get less of these thoughts all bombarding your brain, and you can focus on one thing, which is the signal. You have less noise distracting you. Now, you might think it's a bit weird that drugs that do exactly opposite things all work for ADHD. At least that's what I thought at first. And that is definitely weird. The reason for that is the cause for ADHD. Look, while there are definitely lifestyle factors affecting both the development of ADHD as well as the strength of the symptoms acutely, recent studies show that the heritability of ADHD is about 80%. And the genes affecting the heritability of ADHD span through all kind of different neurotransmitter systems. Obviously the dopaminergic and norepinephrine system, but also GABA, glutamatergic, cholinergic system, serotonergic system, and so on. So you see, this is very complex, but the bottom line is the symptoms of ADHD are extremely individual, and they're not just in general caused by the norepinephrine system and dopamine system. This is also why, for many people, these ADHD medications do not work that well, and a lot of off label medications are used. However, if we look at this meta analysis, as well as my personal experience when talking to psychiatrists, and the overwhelming majority of reviews on medications and discussions in online forums, a clear picture shows that dopamine definitely seems to be the most influential neurotransmitter for ADHD symptoms. Now, looking at this graphic of drug reviews, you may have realized that different drugs that technically use the same active compound are differently well rated for ADHD symptoms. And the reason for that are probably the duration of how long they work and how quickly the active ingredient is released. And that brings us to the specific medications. For this section, we will kind of put aside the alpha 2 agonists, guanfacine and clonidine, as well as Strattera, so atomoxetine and Qelbree, because all of those are supposed to work more long term, and thus the half-life is not that important. However, for stimulants, both how quickly the drug is released and how long it is working is very crucial. And that is why, in addition to the typical fast-acting versions like normal Ritalin, normal Adderall, normal Dexedrine, there are usually also longer-acting versions. And the extent of the release is achieved by two different mechanisms. The more common mechanisms is, in addition to just putting the drug into a normal capsule, the active compound is encapsulated in very tiny balls. And these very tiny balls are dissolving at different rates in our body, each releasing a very small amount of the active ingredient at a time, and thus over the day we always get like little micro peaks of the drug, and it slowly accumulates and gives us a very stable blood level of the drug. Now, personally, I find the second mechanism very, very brilliant. For dextroamphetamine, there is also lisdexamfetamine. And this is a drug usually coming in the form of Vyvanse, but there are also generic versions. And as I already mentioned earlier, this drug basically just binds the amino acid lysine to the dextroamphetamine molecule. And this is so interesting because it basically makes the drug useless. Then only after chopping off the lysine enzymes slowly over the day in our red blood cells is the lisdexamfetamine turned into the active dextroamphetamine, which actually exerts the effects that we want in our body. Now, let me tell you why I think this is such a brilliant strategy. To do so, we have to understand why extended release drugs are even used. And there are two main reasons for that. Obviously, quick-acting drugs have a fast rise and a fast fall of the active ingredient in our blood. And that can be unpleasant to many people because, first of all, they can perceive it as a crash, which gives them headache or a down in the afternoon, and they just don't have the effect of the drug all day, which they need for attention. But the main reason of using extended release drugs is that both the height of the peak and how fast the peak comes after using the drugs is very relevant for the habituation and the development of addiction to a drug. And oftentimes with addiction comes abuse. Now, the key thing about lisdexamfetamine is that it can basically not be abused. Look, while normal extended release Adderall or methylphenidate like Ritalin XR, they can just be ground down and you destroy the encapsulation. Now, no one should do this, that's kind of risky, but technically it works, and you would just have the instant release formula of the drug. In addition, amphetamines, as everyone who has ever seen a junkie knows, cannot just be consumed orally, but they can also be snorted, they can be injected, they can even be smoked. And those are all methods of abuse of the drug, which technically, of course, you could inject lisdexamfetamine, but it just wouldn't do anything. Because remember, the lisdexamfetamine itself has no effect, and the bottleneck in how fast it works and in how high the peak is not the digestive tract and consuming it orally. It is how quickly our red blood cells can chop off the lysine. And there is, to my knowledge, no way to significantly speed up how fast the lysine is chopped off the dextroamphetamine molecule in our red blood cells. If you know any way, I would be really interested. Please write it in the comments. but I don't know any method, and that is why I think this is such a genius strategy. Anyways, sorry for elaborating on this so long. You probably can tell I kind of like these small biochemistry tricks, but the bottom line is, for the non-stimulant drugs, the half-life is not that important, while for the stimulants it is very important, and it is extended through two different mechanisms. Now, while I just explained the pros of extended release drugs, there are definitely also downsides to it, and the most major one is sleep. This is something I personally suffered a lot from as well regarding these extended release drugs. And if you want a detailed video on how to solve sleep issues due to stimulants, please let me know in the comments, because I really did a lot of research on this topic and tried out a lot to really find the best ways. Now, that much regarding the dry theory and mechanisms. Now let's look at what we can actually deduct from those mechanisms and theory, and what practical implications that might have. Again, this is not medical advice, this is my experience and my own thoughts on the subject. Please discuss anything regarding this with your psychiatrist. Let's look into this tree system. So, I make this very simple. And of course, there are way more symptoms of ADHD and a lot more side effects, but I think this is a very solid base regarding the mechanisms, which is very easy to understand. So I divided the symptoms of ADHD, which we want to treat, into concentration issues and low drive. The concentration issues I separated into disinterest and generally being inattentive. The disinterest basically means technically one could focus on something. If you're really interested in whatever, you can focus on it. You can read it, you can play video games and you focus on the video game. But if something is not interesting to you, you're reading a mathematics script or whatever, and you're just not interested, you cannot focus on it. On the other hand, generally being inattentive means that there are always a bunch of thoughts coming in your head. When you're trying to study, you rather listen to the discussions on the neighboring desk, or you suddenly want to check the weather, you suddenly want to change the background on your laptop. I think if you have those kind of symptoms, you get what I mean. Now, drive issues are separated into three different categories: being tired, having low drive, and having too much energy. All of them could be related to ADHD. By tired, I just mean you can technically focus, but you're just too tired mentally for the most part. If you have a lot of caffeine, you get done what you want to get done. You can study, you can work, whatever, but in general, you're very tired. Having low drive means that you're not really tired. You don't need to nap during the day or anything like that, but you're just not having the drive to start anything. You just want to watch Netflix all day and chill, but you're not tired. Having too much energy, on the other hand, means that you're just always switching tasks. You're a very multitasking person, and you just don't stick to one thing. You never get something done because you have so many things that you want to do that are coming up, and you always run around. You can't sit still. That is what I mean by too much energy. Now, looking at the side effect tree, I think there is one category of side effects which we can evaluate based on the mechanisms that we discussed very well, and that is stimulation. I categorize this into being sedated and into being restless. Sedation means basically that you're tired, while being restless means that you can't really take breaks. You're uncomfortable taking breaks. You feel like you have some underlying anxiety in your body. Maybe you feel like your heart is racing when you're laying in bed and you can't calm down at night. Now, what do we do with these trees? We basically look at the neurotransmitters and we look at their effects, which we discussed before, and then we deduct what would be the right neurotransmitter effects for each of these reasons for medication or for side effects, etc. So, starting with disinterest. This, I would say, is one of the more simple ones, because interest equals dopamine. Dopamine makes you interested in honesty in everything. And that means if we want to increase our interest in whatever topic, we have to increase the amount of dopamine we are sensing while we're doing that task. So increasing dopamine right here. Next one, being inattentive. In this case, increasing dopamine is probably also the most important factor. And regarding noradrenaline, this is a little bit of a sticky one. In general, decreasing noradrenaline could help to increase the signal to noise ratio, But for example, atomoxetine also increases the signal to noise ratio by increasing dopamine. So this one you would probably have to try around a little bit yourself, what works best for you. Generally, obviously, all the drugs that increase dopamine are also increasing noradrenaline, so those go hand in hand. We will look at the exact drugs in a moment. First of all, we're continuing with the drive issues, starting with tiredness. Generally, I want to say, even though this is a video specific for ADHD and specifically discussing drugs for ADHD, I personally would say tiredness is very often not an ADHD issue. When people are very tired, it is often some other underlying health issue or it's just a lifestyle issue. But it can also be an issue regarding ADHD. And in general, this is something where people would increase noradrenaline because that is what gives you this force to move forward and to get going. Next one, low drive. This one, also very simple. We have to increase dopamine and we have to increase noradrenaline to increase our drive. Both of these neurotransmitters are very important for drive. Dopamine, again, is more like a pleasurable kind of, I want to do something. And noradrenaline is, I better do it, else whatever negative thing happens. Different ways to increase drive, but both increase drive, and all the drugs that increase dopamine also increase noradrenaline, at least regarding the drugs that are used for ADHD. And the last one is a little bit of a tricky one again, which is too much energy, a very typical symptom of ADHD. And very interestingly, in people that have ADHD, stimulants are often making them more calm. Some people even take stimulants to go to sleep, where I would say, obviously, getting to sleep is better than not sleeping, but I'm pretty sure there's no way that sleep quality is good when people take these drugs for sleeping. Regardless of that, it is quite interesting that people with ADHD can be calmed down by stimulants, and that is why, even though naturally one would expect that here would help to lower noradrenaline, that is not necessarily the case. Stimulants can help here as well. So for both noradrenaline and dopamine, this is not super clear. Generally, stimulants are the first line of drugs to try, but if they're not working well, this is definitely a case where non-stimulants like alpha-2 agonists can be used. Now, wrapping it up with the side effects, starting with sedation, this is a pretty simple one. When it is a side effect from ADHD treatment, while there can be sedating side effects from off-label uses of, for example, antidepressants, regarding the medications that we just discussed, really only Qelbree or the alpha-2 agonists are sedating, and they should either just be reduced or they should be combined with a stimulatory drug to reduce the side effect. Regarding the restlessness, it gets more interesting. And the question here really is whether someone is restless all day and suffers from it all day, or whether the restlessness is only an issue at night. If someone is restless all day, there are three options: reducing stimulants in general, switching from methylphenidate to amphetamines, because remember, amphetamines increase dopamine more per increase of norepinephrine. And that means that there is going to be less restlessness because that's usually caused by a very high norepinephrine. And the third option here would be to combine a stimulant with an alpha-2 agonist, because then you're still getting the dopaminergic effects from the stimulant, but you're somewhat reducing the restlessness effects from the norepinephrine by reducing the noradrenergic signaling through the alpha-2 agonism. Now, if the restlessness is only an issue for sleep, first of all, obviously the main idea to try here would be to use the stimulant as early as possible. Don't take your Adderall at 6 p.m. when you want to go to bed at 10, because it's very likely that it still has a strong effect and you're not going to be able to sleep. Take it right after getting up. Ideally, get up at the same time every day and go to sleep at the same time every day, so that there is no huge fluctuation in how long the distance from getting up and going to sleep is. But this is quite obvious, I guess. The second idea would be to switch from an extended release version of a drug to a short-acting version. For example, switching from extended release Adderall to basic Adderall, or switching from Vyvanse to Dexedrine. And the last idea also in this case would be introducing an alpha-2 agonist. In this case, it may make more sense to use something like clonidine at night, but we're getting into the exact drugs now. So let's wrap it up with the exact drugs someone could use based on these theoretical thoughts. Regarding the disinterest, both amphetamines and methylphenidate would be options. In general, probably drugs that increase dopamine more than norepinephrine would be preferable, which means Dexedrine or Vyvanse would maybe be the best one, then Adderall, then methylphenidate. Regarding general inattentiveness, again, both amphetamines and methylphenidate would be options, but also the non-stimulants would all be worth a try if the stimulants are either not working good or you want to add something that reduces the stimulation but still gives you the attention you need. Regarding the tiredness, again, methylphenidate and amphetamines are both possible options. In this case, probably methylphenidate would be preferable because compared to Adderall or other amphetamines, it proportionally increases norepinephrine more, and norepinephrine is more relevant for tiredness. However, modafinil is also very often used as an off-label prescription regarding tiredness, and in my opinion is probably the better choice. Regarding the lack of drive, again, dopamine and norepinephrine both very important, and is really kind of individual whether methylphenidate or amphetamines would be the better choice here. Regarding having too much energy, again, as very often, the stimulants, amphetamines and methylphenidate are choices, but in this case also the non-stimulants could be working well, also in combination with the stimulants. Looking at the side effects, starting with sedation, obviously as I already mentioned, reducing the alpha-2 agonist if you're using one, and or combining it with a stimulatory drug. In this case again, methylphenidate might be preferable because of its higher proportional increase in norepinephrine when compared to amphetamines. And lastly, looking at restlessness, if it is restlessness that lasts all day, we kind of already discussed that, switch from methylphenidate to amphetamines, reduce the stimulants in general, or introduce an inhibitory drug like guanfacine. If the restlessness is only an issue at night, switch from a long-acting drug like extended Adderall to normal Adderall or Vyvanse to Dexedrine, or possibly take something like clonidine at night, which is a shorter-acting version of the alpha-2 agonist in comparison to guanfacine. That is why generally guanfacine is preferred for ADHD symptoms, because you kind of want to have the effect all day. But if you only want to reduce the adrenergic signaling for sleep, then it probably makes sense to use something like clonidine because it brings you down at night, it helps you get to sleep, it helps you calm down. But in the morning, when you don't really need it anymore, the effects are kind of fading out. Generally, there are also a lot of sleep-promoting drugs used when there are sleep issues with stimulants. Again, as I mentioned before, I personally had a lot of sleep issues, so if you're interested in a video regarding the subject, which strategies could work best, write it in the comments and I will make a very extensive and detailed video that covers all questions. So, to wrap it up, first of all, huge props to you for sticking through all the dry, theoretical, mechanistic background information. I hope the practical implications that I would personally draw from this were helpful to you and made it kind of understandable. One last note, I already mentioned there are combinations of different ADHD medications, and that's in general possible. Even though technically it is also possible to combine different stimulants and might make sense sometimes, most psychiatrists are not that open to it, and in general it is definitely the preferred version to combine a non-stimulant, specifically alpha-2 agonists, with a stimulant. That can be very helpful for many people. And also, I briefly touched on this several times, there are a lot of possible off-label prescriptions for ADHD, and that brings me to underlining again how important it is that you find a good psychiatrist that listens to you, that looks at your feedback, and that tailors your treatment personally to you. That being said, I would be very interested now in reading your comments on what medications you tried, what didn't work for you, what worked for you, or whether you're still trying to figure it out. So I will read your comments, I'm looking forward to it, and see you in the next video.